His name is David. He is 26 years old. 3 weeks ago, the two most arrogant detectives in the precinct, who also happened to be his estranged older half-brothers, publicly humiliated him on his first day as a rookie, entirely unaware of his true bloodline. The iced coffee they deliberately knocked over his uniform soaked through his pressed blue shirt, the cold liquid chilling his skin in the drafty briefing room. They laughed, assuming he was just another nobody they could break. But before the month was over, they would be silently handing over their badges, while the chief of police stood before the entire department and finally claimed David as his true successor. Before we tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story of silent endurance and ultimate justice resonates with you. Drop your city and local time in the comments. We love knowing where you are listening from. To understand the events in that briefing room, one must understand the Sterling family legacy. The precinct was practically owned by Police Chief Thomas Sterling, a man who valued departmental optics above all else. Thomas had two recognized sons, Marcus and Vance. They were the golden boys of the city, both promoted to detective before their 30th birthdays. Marcus wore expensive tailored suits that stretched his salary, and Vance drove a sports car he parked in the fire lane without consequence. They were loud, performative, and ruthless. David, however, was the quiet consequence of a past Thomas preferred to keep hidden. Raised on the other side of town by his mother, David grew up watching the Sterling dynasty from a distance. When his mother passed, David was entirely alone, except for his grandmother. Eleanor was Thomas's mother, a sharp, unyielding woman with silver hair and a walking cane carved from mahogany. She saw through her grandson's arrogance and recognized the quiet, steady competence in David. While Thomas poured his wealth into Marcus and Vance's political ambitions, Eleanor privately paid for David's education. During a quiet Thanksgiving dinner at her modest home, a stark contrast to the Sterling estate, she handed David an envelope containing the funds for the police academy. She told him, quietly, that true authority is earned in the dark, not inherited in the light. The pattern of exclusion began long before David ever put on a uniform. The first instance occurred during the summer David turned 18. It was the annual Police Benevolent Association picnic. David was hired through a temp agency to bus tables. Marcus and Vance, wearing matching aviator sunglasses, sat at the VIP table. When David reached for Vance's empty plate, Vance deliberately dropped his half-eaten barbecue rib onto David's clean white sneaker. Vance didn't apologize, he just smirked and told David to fetch him a fresh napkin. David felt the grease soaking through the canvas of his shoe, but he simply wiped the table and walked away. 2 years later, grandmother Eleanor passed away. The funeral was held on a bitterly cold Tuesday in January. The wind whipped off the river, stinging the faces of the mourners. David stood at the back of the cemetery wearing a thrift store suit that didn't quite keep out the chill. When the service ended, Thomas, Marcus, and Vance climbed into a heated Blacktown car. Marcus made eye contact with David through the tinted glass, then reached over and locked the door before the driver pulled away, leaving David to walk 3 miles to the bus stop in the freezing rain. The final insult happened the day David graduated from the police academy. He had earned the top academic honors in his class. He stood in the auditorium lobby holding his certificate, the gold foil catching the overhead fluorescent lights. Marcus and Vance walked past on their way to congratulate a different rookie, the son of the mayor. Marcus bumped David's shoulder hard enough to send the certificate fluttering to the linoleum floor. "Watch your step, rookie," Marcus said, not even looking back. David knelt, picked up the paper, brushed off the dust, and filed it away. The defining fracture occurred on Monday, October 12th. It was 7:32 a.m., David's very first day on the job. The autumn morning was crisp, and the precinct smelled heavily of stale coffee and floor wax. David stood near the back of the briefing room, quietly reviewing his patrol routes. Marcus and Vance entered, carrying their status like a physical weight. The room of 30 officers quieted. Vance spotted David. Without a word of provocation, Vance walked over, picked up David's newly issued patrol helmet, and tossed it into the trash can next to the door. When David quietly asked him to retrieve it, Marcus stepped in. In front of the entire shift, Marcus loudly announced that rookies with no pedigree and no talent belonged in the basement archiving files, not on the streets. He poured his large iced coffee directly over David's chest. The ice cubes clattered against David's badge. David did not shout. He did not clench his fists. He felt the cold liquid seeping through his undershirt. He looked at Marcus, then at Vance, and finally around the room at the 30 witnesses who suddenly found the floor very interesting. "Okay, detectives," David said, his voice entirely level. He turned on his heel, walked out of the room, and went to the locker room to change into his spare uniform. If you have ever had to maintain your composure while being tested by arrogant people who thought they held all the power, tell us how you handled it in the comments below. David did not retaliate. Instead, he went to work. For the next 3 weeks, while Marcus and Vance continued to mock him in the hallways, David spent his nights at a small laminate desk in his apartment, working under the yellow glow of a single desk lamp. He activated the resource grandmother Eleanor had left him. Before she died, she had given David a lockbox. Inside was a meticulously kept ledger of the precinct's off-the-books evidence handling, alongside an irrevocable trust document and a signed affidavit from Chief Thomas Sterling acknowledging David's paternity, documents Thomas had been forced to sign years ago to secure a loan from Eleanor. David spent hours cross-referencing Eleanor's ledger with the current arrest reports Marcus and Vance filed. He found the discrepancies. He compiled the paper trail of missing cash and buried complaints. He consulted with an independent state auditor sitting in a quiet diner on the edge of town, carefully passing photocopies across the sticky table. There was only one moment of doubt. At 2 a.m. on a Thursday, staring at the stack of evidence that would end his brother's careers and force his father's hand, David's hands trembled. The apartment was completely silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. He picked up his phone, hovering over the chief's number, wondering if a private conversation would be kinder. But he remembered the ice water on his badge and the lockdown car in the freezing rain. He set the phone down. He placed the files into a pristine manila. The reckoning arrived at the annual Mayor's Commendation Banquet. The ballroom of the downtown hotel was draped in velvet, the tables set with heavy silverware that clinked softly against china. Over 200 people were present, including city councilmen, judges, and the media. Chief Thomas Sterling was at the podium, preparing to pin the Medal of Valor on Marcus and Vance. Vance adjusted his tie, soaking in the applause. Marcus stepped forward to the microphone and smiled. "We owe our success," Marcus said smoothly, "to a precinct that values integrity above all else. We don't tolerate dead weight." From the back of the room, David stood up. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the squeak of David's polished shoes on the hardwood floor as he walked calmly toward the dais. He held the thick manila envelope. He stopped at the foot of the stage. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the clear, level cadence of a man reading the weather report. "Integrity," David said, "is a heavy word, detective." David turned to the mayor, who sat rigidly in his chair. "Mr. Mayor, inside this envelope are the audited financial trails proving Detective Sterling have diverted $60,000 from the evidence room over the past 2 years." He placed the envelope on the edge of the stage. Marcus's face went completely white. The color drained from his cheeks so fast it looked medical. Vance dropped his water glass. It shattered on the stage, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. David turned his eyes to Chief Thomas. "And Chief Sterling, attached to the audit is the notarized affidavit of paternity you signed 20 years ago, the one my grandmother kept." The silence in the ballroom stretched until it felt fragile. 2 city councilmen stood up and immediately walked out the side doors, distancing themselves from the blast radius. Chief Thomas looked at the documents, then at Marcus and Vance, and finally at David. The chief's shoulders slumped, aging 10 years in 10 seconds. Thomas reached out, bypassed his golden boys, and picked up the envelope. The verdict was undeniable. What do you think happened to Marcus and Vance after the truth was exposed to the entire city? Let us know your thoughts before we reveal the aftermath. Envelope: consequences fall on the antagonists while the protagonist remains passive. The dominoes fell swiftly over the next 6 weeks. David did not file lawsuits or speak to the press. He simply worked his patrol routes, listening to the rain tap against the roof of his cruiser. Marcus and Vance were placed on unpaid leave the morning after the banquet. By Friday, the district attorney who had attended the dinner opened a formal investigation. The brothers were stripped of their badges and their pensions were frozen. Marcus's wife filed for divorce by the end of the month, unwilling to weather the social humiliation. Vance was forced to sell his sports car to cover mounting legal fees. Chief Thomas was asked to take an early, quiet retirement. The Sterling dynasty, built on performance and optics, collapsed under the weight of its own paper trail. The Whisper network in the city completely abandoned them. They were no longer the Golden Boys, they were a cautionary tale. 6 months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, David sat at a scarred wooden dining table in the home of his shift sergeant, an older man who had become the mentor Thomas never was. The kitchen smelled of roasting garlic and fresh bread. The autumn sun slanted through the window, warming the wood beneath David's hands. There were no matching china sets, only heavy ceramic plates and genuine laughter. The sergeant's wife poured hot coffee into David's mug. The steam curled into the air. David took a sip, letting the warmth settle into his chest. His phone sat on the counter, silent. There were no voicemails from Marcus. There were no demands from Thomas. There was only the quiet peace of a life built on solid ground, surrounded by people who knew his worth without needing a piece of paper to prove it. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in this story, I want you to know something important. You are allowed to stop trying to earn a place at a table that was never built for you. You are allowed to let people's underestimation of you become their own undoing. You are allowed to prepare your boundaries in silence, and you do not owe anyone a warning before you protect yourself. Family is not defined by blood or a shared last name. Family is who shows up for you in the freezing rain and who hands you the tools to build your own life. Thank you for spending this time with us. If David's journey brought you some peace today, please share this video with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength. We will see you in the next one.